Here are the lesson objectives. You can review those. This particular chapter, we're going to be discussing the property management field and leasing. Of course, leases are an important part of the management of real property. If you're hired as a property manager for an investor, one of your duties is going to be to locate and tenants and then negotiate leases. So we're going to talk a little bit about leases in here, what's required of a valid lease. We're going to talk about property management agreements, what's required with a property management agreement, and then we're going to discuss some fair housing issues, because fair housing probably impacts the leasing field way more than it affects the brokerage, if you will, the buying and selling of property. It's probably where most of the fair housing issues lie, and this is where we'll talk about in this particular lesson here about how fair housing impacts the property management and leasing field, and we can harken back to our lesson 2, which was all about fair housing. So we'll do some reviewing on fair housing as well as leases, lease types, property management agreements, duties the agent has with the property manager. And remember, when you're hired by a property manager, when your property management company is hired by an investor, when an investor hires someone to manage their properties, there's a number of duties that you have to perform for them, not the least of which is leasing property, but also maintaining the property, working with vendors, and giving reports to your client, which is that investor or that owner. So in the property management field, your property management agreements make your company an agent of their client investor, of which you may be then designated as the agent of a particular investor. Key term matching, number 1. What's the definition? What is the term that matches the definition when a tenant transfers only part of their right or possession in a leased property to another person for part of the remaining lease term? That would be considered a sublease. And in a little bit, we're going to come back and talk about which is an assignment. And there's a difference between an assignment and a sublease. Remember, with the sublease, what technically happens is the tenant transfers their interest to another tenant that's going to take over for them, if you will. But the original tenant does come back and retake their tenancy for the remaining term of the lease. So in a sublease, the original tenant will come back to the property. So that means that with a sublease, the original tenant is never released of liability. If your subtenant isn't paying their rent or they're violating the lease, you as the original tenant are going to continue to be liable. So the big deal with the sublease is, let's say you have a year lease, and you're going to leave in June, and you're going to go to Europe on a vacation, and you're going to be gone for 3 months. Maybe during that time you sublease to a friend of yours your unit from June 1 to, let's say, September 1, and then you come back on September 1 and retake possession. That's a sublease. So you as the original tenant continue to be liable for all the terms and conditions of that lease. You're not released of liability. We'll see that is true with the assignment in just a minute. Number 2, the contract under which a tenant pays a portion of the gross sales in addition to rent. So these are retail leases. Retail leases, sometimes called percentage leases. This is where the retail tenant pays the shopping center management company a flat fee for a flat rental for their space each month, same amount. But what does change is the percentage that they pay of their gross sales as far as a lease payment. So in months where their gross sales are very high, they pay this a percentage of that along with their flat fee. This way, the retail tenant isn't paying exorbitant amounts of rent on months when there's no business. And typically, the retail people, most of their income comes from basically from Thanksgiving through Christmas. Number 3, a tenant leases unimproved land on a long-term basis and typically includes a provision that provides that the tenant will construct a building on the unimproved land, which the tenant will then own when the completion of the building is done. So this would be a ground lease, where essentially that tenant is a ground tenant. He's simply leasing the ground and then he's putting a building on it. That building is going to be owned by the tenant who's constructing the building only for the term of the lease. Now, when the lease expires, the tenant is going to lose title to that building because the lease will expire, the building will still be on it, and the landlord or the owner of the property will then own the property. So these get kind of complicated because typically what happens with ground leases is they're for a long period of time, 40 years, sometimes 50 years, and they typically require a renewal period of a like amount of years. So what's basically going to happen is that tenant, while they'll eventually lose title to the building, they'll get their return on it over a period of time. Plus, they get depreciation write-offs each year on the building that they own it, and they're typically leasing the building out during that time. So there are ways that they work this out between the landlord and the ground tenant. Number 4, a contract in which the rent changes throughout the lease term. And this would be a graduated lease. These typically are commercial leases. Most commercial leases, industrial lease, manufacturing, warehousing, they're built so that the base rent will change each year for the period of time. Most of them are written for 5 and 7 year periods, sometimes longer. But during that time, there would be a graduated increase in the monthly rent that the commercial tenant would be paying. A written contract that governs the relationship between a property owner investor and the property manager and outlines the duties. Of course, that's going to be a property management agreement. The guarantee that a buyer or a tenant has the right to exclusive undisturbed possession of a house of a leasehold estate would be a covenant of quiet enjoyment. Basically, what happens is the clause in a lease under the covenant of quiet enjoyment clause. A covenant is a promise. Quiet enjoyment doesn't mean it's going to be quiet on the premises. It means that nobody of greater title than the landlord has is going to come along and say, landlord doesn't even own this property. He has no right to lease it. Therefore, you have to leave. So the landlord is making you a promise that that's not going to happen. A contract under which a tenant pays all taxes, insurance, plus utilities and rent. These are considered net leases. Some people call them double net leases, sometimes triple net leases. And for our purposes, that's kind of beyond our scope. But essentially, a net lease means that the landlord, when he gets his rentals, it's a net number because the expenses have already been paid by the commercial tenant. So, landlords like net leases. That money that they get in rent then goes right in their pocket because basically most of the operating expenses for that particular building is paid by your commercial tenants. That's what makes these commercial net leases very desirable leases. One party transfers their rights or interest in a contract to another party, and then it should go on to say, and then is released of liability. This is the assignment that we talked about. In a lease, it would work, let's think of a commercial lease. Let's say I've got a 7-year commercial lease on my 5,000 square retail store downtown, wherever, Wheaton, Illinois. and turns out that my business is flourishing. I need a bigger place. I've got 2 years left on my lease. What am I going to do? Well, I can go out and shop for a bigger space and then turn around with my existing space and offer an assignment on it to other tenants. In other words, the real estate brokers, commercial real estate brokers, will shop my current lease, 5,000 square foot lease, and with 2 years remaining on it, and the new tenant can come in and I can assign my rights to him. A landlord can't prohibit me basically from doing that. So in an assignment then I can assign my rights in my current lease to a new tenant for the remaining term of the lease. The big thing about an assignment is I'm now out of it. It's solely up to the new tenant to adhere to all the lease terms and make their monthly lease payments. And if they don't, only they're going to be held responsible. So the big difference with the assignment and the sublease is with the assignment, I give the rest of the remaining lease term to a new tenant. I assign it to him, and then I'm done with it. I'm out of it. Not true with the sublease. The provision that grants possession of the property to the lessee, again, this would be a leasing term. There would be a clause in a lease called the demising clause, and it officially conveys the right of possession to the tenant. So the demising clause basically is the promise that the current owner of the property, who has all the rights of possession, control, enjoyment, disposition, exclusion, he has all those rights, but he basically gives them up under the right of possession, if you will, to a tenant. That's called the demising clause. A licensee engaged to oversee the management of a number of properties for various owners. Of course, that's going to be our property manager. The money that tenant pays to the landlord to cover any damage to the residence, if it's a residential property, and you're still going to have to pay this if you're a commercial tenant on commercial properties as well. If there's any damage to the property, this money can be used to defray costs to the landlord to rehab the property so they can release it again. And that would be the security deposit. 12, a contract under which the lessor pays all operating and maintenance costs associated with the property. So this is where the landlord does pay the expenses on the property. And that's called a gross lease, because the amount of rent that goes to the landlord under let's think of a residential lease. When you write your check to the landlord, Mr. Tenant, for your monthly rent, the landlord's got to then turn around and take all of his rentals and pay the property operating expenses, whether they be taxes or maintenance or other expenses. So with gross leases, the amount that goes to the landlord is a gross amount of which he has to pay expenses and then nets that out at the end of the year. The net lease, the commercial net lease, we call them net leases because essentially with the commercial lease, the amount that goes to the landlord is net. The expenses have already been paid for him. Fill in the blank. A lease temporarily transfers the right of the property from the lessor or landlord to the lessee tenant. The lessor, the giver of the leased property, the lessee, the receiver of the leased property, the tenant. In the property owner-property manager relationship, the property owner is the principal or client, and the property manager would represent them as their agent. The security deposit helps the landlord ensure compliance with the lease. The channeling of prospective tenants to specific properties or neighborhoods based on their membership in a protected class is a prohibitive act known as, remember this from our lesson 2, racial or ethnic steering, illegal. Someone who remains in possession of property after the lease has expired is known as a holdover tenant. So when someone holds over after their tenancy has terminated, is called a holdover tenancy. Because that's the estate that the holdover tenant has. It's called a holdover tenancy. One of two things is going to happen. Either the landlord's going to say, "Gee, I'm glad you stayed over. We never did get around to signing a new lease. How about we do that right now?" And the tenant says, "Great, glad to hear it. I was hoping we would do that." So everybody's happy. A new lease is signed. A landlord's happy. Tenant stays on that premise. However, it might be that the landlord doesn't want that holdover tenant to stay over, in which case he tells the holdover tenant, "You have to leave now." And the holdover tenant says, "I'm not going to leave." So now that the tenant has been officially notified that the lease is not going to be renewed, he becomes a tenant at sufferance, if you will. He has an illegal tenancy. And the way you have to get, Mr. Landlord, the way you have to get that illegal holdover tenant out, having their tenancy by sufferance, the way you get them out is you have to go through a formal suit for possession, or what most people call an eviction proceeding. Actual eviction, which is exactly what we described, is the legal process of dispossessing or expelling someone from real property, if you will, that illegal holdover tenant. Calculate this calculation. Annual gross income minus vacancy loss minus expenses is net operating income. That's the big number that investors want when they have investment property. Let's say multi-unit apartment buildings. Investors don't particularly care what the property sells for. They don't or they're going to purchase it for. They don't particularly care what the cap rates are. They don't particularly care what the gross income is. I mean, they do, but the point I'm trying to make is that what they really care about is the bottom line, what they can expect annually in net operating income. That's the big number. What am I going to walk away with in my jeans each year if I buy this investment property? We use net income and we use cap rate and we use value as ways of computing a lot of this stuff for investors. The Americans with Disability Act prohibits a landlord from refusing to let a renter make reasonable modifications to the housing. And I go one step further. I think the reasonable modifications should be made by the landlord. If the landlord is going to refuse to make reasonable modifications, and that tenant doesn't want to take them to fair housing court, which they probably could, the tenant might just say, "You know what, I'll make these modifications myself." And if they're reasonable modifications, they don't require big build outs, basically, landlord, you can't prohibit them from doing that. 9, an occupancy policy establishes the maximum number of people allowable in a given rental unit. These are usually done by community. Sometimes they're done by county. And in that area, there will be a building ordinance that says in 2-bedroom apartments in our community, only 4 people can occupy them that aren't family members and not related and not married, or whatever it might be. Or it could be, there could be 5, if you have children under the age of, all children are under the age of 3, or whatever it might be. So you'd have to find out whether or not a family would be violating an occupancy policy. You'd have to go and read it. And they're very different. So you just can't go and start evicting people because you think there's too many people in the property, or they're not the right mix of relatives versus non-relatives, parents versus children. It can be pretty complicated, but you have to check that before you start evicting people thinking that they're violating an occupancy policy. 10, a gross lease, we just talked about, is one in which the tenant pays rent and then the landlord turns around and pays the expenses. Protected classes, just as a review for us, George and Betty have twin toddlers. Would they be protected? Yes, under the familial status classification. Lauren is pregnant with her first child. Is Lauren protected? Yes, again, familial status. Luke is a 75-year-old retired Navy captain. He really isn't protected unless for some reason in Illinois you refused to rent to him because he was dishonorable discharged before he retired or something to that effect. Okay, but typically no, he wouldn't fall into any protected categories. Vern is addicted to prescribed painkillers. Vern might be, but remember that in order to qualify for protection under the Disability Acts, you have to be in a recognized drug or alcohol treatment program. So let's say Vern is addicted to prescribed painkillers, but he is in a rehab program. Jacob has been diagnosed with HIV. Well, he is protected, but remember now, he's so protected that we can't tell anybody about his HIV diagnosis. So if Jacob were a seller and a buyer asked, does the seller have AIDS? Because if they do, that's going to creep me out, and I'm not going to buy the property. We can't disclose that. They're protected for under, if you will, confidentiality. Penelope is an undercover police officer. Penelope is not covered under any of the Fair Housing Acts, at least federal and state. Maybe there are some local ones I don't know about. Ike is a single man living with his elderly mother. Okay, Ike isn't protected. Billy is a Gulf War veteran who lost an arm in combat. Probably Billy would be protected, again, a legitimate disability. Janice is an unemployed white woman who receives public assistance. She is not protected under the federal acts, but she would be protected under the Illinois Act. On source of income would be her category for protection. Zhao is a recent immigrant from China, so he would be protected under his nationality. Kevin's a foster parent who currently cares for an infant. Yes, Kevin's protected. Mike and Jack are a gay couple. Yes, they are. Under the federal statutes now, they would be protected under sex. So I'm going to they are protected. Alicia is a practicing Hindu. Yes, religion. Andy and Ann are an unmarried couple with a 19-year-old son. No, they're not protected. Harvey's an alcoholic, only again if Harvey's in a recognized drug and alcohol treatment program. True or false? In Illinois, everyone who works for a property management company and interacts with tenants must have a real estate license. Well, that's a little broad. I don't like the word everyone. Basically, if you work for a property management company and you're involved in any what we would call real estate activities, that would be offering property for lease, negotiating leases, marketing for tenants, perhaps interviewing tenants, qualifying tenants, showing the leased properties. Yes, you'd have to be licensed. But if you're a maintenance worker, for instance, or you work in the office where you collect rents when the tenants can come in and give you their rental checks, probably not. Familial status refers to two-parent families with children of any age. Of course, that's false. Familial status refers to one or two-parent families or guardians of children of under the age of 18. Variable expenses occur on a regular basis. Fixed expenses are not consistent and regular. This is a property management accounting question, if you will. And that's false. Variable expenses vary month to month. Fixed expenses are pretty consistent and pretty regular. This is important to know when you're doing your annual budgeting, isn't it? Which are your variable expenses and which are your fixed expenses. The fixed expenses are a little easier to budget for than the variable expenses. In Illinois, an oral lease for less than 1 year is generally enforceable. That would be false. Remember the statute of frauds, if you have a lease for more than 1 year, it must be in writing. A property management has a fiduciary obligation to a property owner. Yes. Contract rent is what the property could rent for on the open market. That's false. Contract rent is the rent that is included in the contract, which may or may not represent what some books call economic rent. And that would be once you could rent a unit like this for the open market. Maybe it's a new development and they have teaser rates to get people in. So you might get a rent way below market value, way below economic value that you could get that the other properties in the area are renting on the open market. So your contract rent would be lower than what would be the economic rent or market rent. Lessees have a reversionary interest in the property, which means that eventually the property reverts to them at the end of the lease term. False. Once you become a tenant, you can never claim by adverse possession or any other means of a title to the property. Once you become a tenant, your rights are always subservient to the owner's rights. A lease that automatically renews annually creates an estate for years. No, a lease that automatically renews annually would be an estate for year to year, and that would be usually on the same period of time when it's renewing. So not a good idea to have any leases that automatically renew anyway. Most tenants, most landlords don't want that because you want to be able to negotiate a new lease depending on market conditions, and that might be favorable for the tenant. Maybe leases in the following years may be less than leases this year because maybe competitor buildings have gone up, and so that might drive your rent down. Or maybe you've been a good tenant somewhere for years and years and years, and now when your lease comes up for renewal, the landlord would be more than happy to give you maybe a better lease because of your loyalty and because you've been a tenant in the building. With a net lease, or double or triple net, the tenant pays rent plus maintenance, operating expenses, as well as insurance, and usually a portion of property taxes. So even the landlord gets a little bit of property taxes. So that's true. Triple net lease, you're going to pay your rent plus a number of other additional operating or property related expenses. So that's why they're called net leases, because when you do pay your rent, the landlord is happy because all these other expenses have been paid for him. One of the property manager's main job is to create income for the owners. Yes, that's an important job. Okay, move on to scenario 1 with lesson 5, working with the property manager, and do parts 1-1 to 1-5.